My son sold the only house I ever built with my own hands. I didn't hear it from him, not even a word in passing. I learned about it from someone else after the papers were already signed. In that moment, I understood. I was no longer part of the life I thought I had built for my family. I had been erased quietly, like a shadow fading from the wall. I can still feel the weight of that first 2x4 in my hands. 28 years old, standing in an empty lot with nothing but a dream and a bank loan that scared me half to death. My wife Sarah stood beside me, her hand resting on her growing belly, and she looked at that patch of dirt like she could already see our future there. "This is it," I whispered to her. "This is where we build our life." Every weekend for 2 years, I was out there, hammer in hand, level in my back pocket, sawdust in my hair. My father-in-law said I was crazy to try building it myself, but I needed to know that every nail, every board, every corner of that house came from my own sweat. When you're a man providing for your family, there's something sacred about creating shelter with your own hands. I remember the first wall we raised. Sarah brought me sweet tea in a mason jar, and I could hear our neighbor's radio playing something soft through the summer air. The sun was setting, painting everything golden, and for a moment I stopped hammering just to breathe it in. This wasn't just construction. This was the beginning of everything that mattered. Room by room, I built our world. The kitchen where Sarah would hum while she cooked Sunday dinners. The living room where we'd watch our children take their first steps. 3 bedrooms upstairs, 1 for us, and 2 for the babies we hoped would fill them with laughter. And they did fill them. First came Michael, then 2 years later, little Emma. Those walls heard their first words. Watch them grow from crawling babies to running children. I'd lie in bed some nights, listening to their breathing through the thin walls, and feel this overwhelming sense of completion. Like I had done what a father was supposed to do. I had built them safety. I had built them home. The house grew with us. Scuff marks on the hardwood where Michael dragged his toy trucks. Pencil marks on the doorframe of the hall closet where we measured their height every birthday. The back porch I added when Emma was 5 because she wanted a place to play with her dolls outside. Every addition, every repair, every coat of paint, it was all love made visible. 23 years I spent perfecting that house. When the roof leaked during the storm of '98, I was up there patching it myself, even though my back wasn't what it used to be. When the kitchen needed updating, I spent months learning about tile and plumbing so I could do it right. Sarah would find me in the garage at midnight, sanding cabinet doors by hand because I wanted them smooth as silk. "You don't have to be perfect, David," she'd say, bringing me coffee and rubbing my shoulders. But she was wrong. For them, for my family, it did have to be perfect, or as close as these old hands could make it. The holidays were the best. Christmas morning with wrapping paper scattered across the living room floor. Thanksgiving dinner stretched long into the evening around the dining room table I'd built myself. Easter egg hunts in the backyard where I'd planted Sarah's favorite roses. The house wasn't just our shelter, it was the keeper of our traditions, the silent witness to our joy. If you've ever felt the deep satisfaction of providing for the ones you love most, you understand what that house meant to me. And if my words touch something in your heart, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Your support means more than... And you know, Michael and Emma grew, as children do. High school graduation parties on the back deck, prom pictures by the front door. The day we helped Emma pack for college, her room suddenly too quiet, too empty. Then Michael's turn 2 years later. Sarah and I stood in his doorway after the moving truck pulled away, and the silence felt different. Not peaceful, hollow. "It's just us now," Sarah whispered, taking my hand. But even just us felt like enough. We had built something lasting, something that would always call them home. Or so I thought. Sarah passed 3 years ago. Cancer took her quickly, mercifully, the doctors said. But there's no mercy in watching the love of your life fade away in the bedroom where you've shared 32 years of dreams and arguments and quiet Sunday mornings. After the funeral, Michael stayed for a week. Emma flew in from Portland and stayed too. They helped me sort through their mother's things, pack away her clothes, decide what to keep and what to donate. But when they left, the silence that remained wasn't the comfortable quiet Sarah and I had learned to share. It was the silence of abandonment. I wandered through those rooms like a ghost haunting his own life. The kitchen table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together now set for one. The living room where we'd watched the children grow, now just me and the evening news. Even my workshop in the basement felt foreign, all my tools hanging in perfect order with no project calling for their use. The house began to feel too big, too full of memories that had nowhere to go. I'd catch myself setting 2 coffee cups in the morning or calling upstairs to ask Sarah something before remembering she wasn't there to answer. The walls that had once held our laughter now seemed to echo with everything we'd lost. Michael called every Sunday at first. We'd talk about work, about the weather, about now, no thing that mattered. The conversations grew shorter each week, more polite, more distant. He had his own life now, his own apartment across town, his own concerns. I understood that. I did. But understanding something and accepting it are different things entirely. Standing in that empty house night after night, I told myself this was natural. This was what happened when children grew up and parents grew old. The family spreads out, roots deepen in new soil, and the old homestead becomes just a building full of furniture and memories. But deep in my chest, in the place where a father keeps his worst fears, I felt something shifting, something I wasn't ready to name yet. Time has a way of stretching when you're waiting for something that might never come. Those Sunday phone calls from Michael became every other Sunday, then monthly, then whenever he remembered or felt guilty enough to dial my number. I started marking them on the calendar, small red X's that tracked the growing distance between us. 23 days, 31 days, 6 weeks, each gap longer than the last, each conversation shorter when it finally came. "How are you doing, Dad?" "Oh, I'm fine. Keeping busy. You know how it is." But I wasn't fine, and I wasn't busy. And he didn't know how it was because he never asked beyond that first polite question. We'd cover the weather, his job at the engineering firm, my garden, the neighbors, safe topics that skimmed across the surface of our lives like stones across still water, never sinking deep enough to matter. I'd hang up the phone and sit in my chair, the same recliner I'd sat in for 15 years, and wonder when we'd stop knowing how to talk to each other. When I was young, my own father and I barely spoke at all. I'd sworn things would be different with my son. I'd be the kind of father who listened, who was present, who built a bridge instead of a wall. For years, I thought I'd succeeded. Michael and I used to talk about everything. His dreams of becoming an engineer like his old man, his teenage heartbreaks, his worries about college. We'd spend Saturday mornings working on projects together, fixing the deck, tuning up the car, building that treehouse he'd begged for when he was 8. "Hand me that wrench, son." "This one, Dad?" "That's the one. Now watch how I adjust this joint." Those moments felt sacred then. Father teaching son, passing down not just knowledge but belonging. The quiet satisfaction of working with your hands alongside someone who shares your blood, your name, your stubborn way of wanting to fix everything yourself. But somewhere along the way, the conversations had thinned. The Saturday projects stopped. Michael got busy with his own life, his own friends, his own version of the future that didn't seem to include much room for his father's voice. His last visit home was 3 months ago. I'd made his favorite dinner, pot roast with potatoes, the way his mother used to cook it. Set the table with Sarah's good china, even lit a candle like she always did for special occasions. He arrived an hour late, apologizing about traffic that didn't exist on a Tuesday evening in our small town. Glanced around the dining room like he was seeing it for the first time instead of the 1,000th. His attention kept drifting to his phone, checking messages that seemed more important than the conversation I'd been rehearsing all week. "The house looks good, Dad," he said, but his eyes were already scanning for the exit. "I repainted the front porch last month, used that blue-gray your mother always liked." "That's nice." Nice. 43 years of being his father, and I'd been reduced to nice. He stayed for exactly 2 hours, said he had an early meeting, had to get back to his apartment to prepare, hugged me goodbye. In that quick, awkward way men do when they're afraid of appearing too soft. Promised to call soon, to visit again next month, to spend more time together. All promises I'd heard before, and all promises that seemed to dissolve the moment his taillights disappeared around the corner. I stood in the doorway long after he was gone, looking out at the street where he'd learned to ride his bicycle, where I'd taught him to throw a baseball, where he'd backed out of the driveway that first day with his driver's license, grinning and terrified and absolutely certain he could conquer the world. That boy had looked at me like I held all the answers. This man looked at me like I was just another item on his to-do list. something to check off between more important obligations. The pot roast sat heavy in my stomach that night. I wrapped the leftovers in foil and put them in the refrigerator, where they sat for a week before I finally threw them away. Even the food felt like a rejection, like proof that I'd prepared for a son who no longer existed. I tried to tell myself this was normal. All children pull away from their parents as they build their own lives. It's healthy, natural, the way it's supposed to be. Sarah would have understood this better than I did. She always said I held on too tight, loved too fierce, expected too much. Let him find his own way, David, she used to say when I worried about Michael's choices, his friends, his future. He'll come back to us when he's ready. But Sarah had been gone 3 years now, and Michael didn't seem to be coming back to anything. If anything, he was drifting further away, like a boat that slipped its anchor and doesn't even realize it's floating out to sea. The nights were the hardest. Sitting in that chair, waiting for the phone to ring, listening to the house settle around me like old bones creaking in the cold. I'd replay it. Our conversations, looking for clues I might have missed, signs of the man my little boy had become. Had I failed him somehow? Been too hard, too soft, too absent, too present? Sarah always said I was a good father, but Sarah loved me. Maybe love made her blind to my failures, the ways I'd let my son down without even knowing it. Or maybe this was just what happened to fathers like me. We build the foundation, raise the walls, provide the shelter, and then watch our children walk away without looking back. We become the past instead of the future, the memory instead of the moment. If you've ever felt your own children slipping away, growing distant despite all your efforts to stay close, you know the particular ache I'm describing. It's not anger, it's something deeper, quieter, more permanent. The slow realization that your voice doesn't carry the weight it used to, that your presence is no longer necessary for their happiness. And if these words resonate with your own experience, I hope you'll take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your story, and subscribe for more. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is the knowledge that we're not alone in our pain. I kept waiting for the phone to ring, kept hoping the next conversation would be different, deeper, more like the talks we used to share when he was young and I was his hero instead of his obligation. But the silence between calls kept growing longer, and I began to understand that waiting was just another form of heartbreak. Tuesday morning, I was on my hands and knees pulling weeds from Sarah's rose garden when Mrs. Henderson came walking her little terrier past my fence. We'd been neighbors for 16 years, the kind of neighbors who wave from across the yard and chat about the weather when we're both checking the mail. "Beautiful morning, isn't it, David?" she called out, and I straightened up, brushing the dirt from my knees. "Sure is. These roses are finally starting to bloom, as how say it. Gain." She stopped at my gate, letting her dog sniff around the fence posts. "Speaking of beautiful things, I heard some wonderful news about your Michael." My heart lifted a little. Maybe he'd gotten a promotion, or finally found a nice girl to settle down with. Maybe there was good news in his life that he'd forgotten to share with his old man. "Oh, what's that?" "Well, quite something. Your boy selling the place. Must be bittersweet for you." The words hit me like a physical blow. I felt my smile freeze on my face, felt something cold and terrible spreading through my chest, but I couldn't let her see that. Couldn't let her know that my own son hadn't bothered to tell me. "Oh, that," I heard myself say, forcing a laugh that sounded hollow even to my own ears. "Yes, well, you know how these things go," she nodded sympathetically. "I imagine it's hard watching him move on to his own chapter. But what a blessing that he found a buyer so quickly. The housing market's been so unpredictable lately." I mumbled something about market conditions and wished her a good day, then stood there watching her walk away, her little dog trotting happily beside her. The morning sun felt too bright suddenly, the air too thick. My legs felt unsteady, like the ground beneath me had shifted without warning. Michael had sold the house. Our house. The house I'd built with my own hands, board by board, nail by nail. The house where he'd taken his first steps, said his first words, grown from boy to man, and he hadn't said a word to me about it. I went inside and sat heavily at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten breakfast every morning for 23 years, where I'd helped him with his homework, where Sarah had bandaged his scraped knees, where we'd celebrated his acceptance to college with chocolate cake and proud tears. The betrayal wasn't just that he'd sold it, it was the silence. the casual assumption that my feelings didn't matter enough to warrant a conversation, that I could learn about the sale of my life's work from a neighbor walking her dog as if I were just another stranger on the street. I tried to imagine how the conversation might have gone if he'd called me first. "Dad, I've been thinking about selling the house. It's too much for me to maintain, and I could use the money for my own place." Maybe I would have understood, maybe I would have been hurt, but at least I would have been included. Instead, he'd made the decision without me, listed it, shown it to strangers, accepted an offer, signed papers, all while I sat in my chair 3 miles away, wondering why he never called anymore. The cruelty of it took my breath away, not because Michael was intentionally cruel, I knew he wasn't, but because my voice had become so insignificant in his life that he hadn't even thought to include me. I'd been erased from the equation so completely that my opinion wasn't worth seeking, my feelings not worth considering. I thought about all the hours I'd spent in that house, not just building it, but living in it, changing diapers at 3 in the morning, reading bedtime stories until my voice was hoarse, teaching Michael to tie his shoes on the front steps. Every room held a piece of my soul, every corner a memory I'd treasured. And now it belonged to strangers. People who would paint over the pencil marks where we'd measured the children's height, who would tear up the kitchen tiles I'd laid so carefully, replace the light fixtures I'd installed, never knowing the love that had gone into every detail. Sarah's rose garden would probably be the first thing to go. New owners always wanted to put their own stamp on a place, and roses required too much care for busy modern families. I could picture someone with a chainsaw cutting down the bushes she'd babied for decades, hauling them away like refuse. The worst part was imagining Michael showing the house, to potential buyers, walking them through our life like it was just square footage and amenities. "This is the living room, gets great natural light. Kitchen was updated 5 years ago. 3 bedrooms upstairs, full basement." Did he tell them about Christmas morning in that living room? About Sarah's laughter echoing from that kitchen? About the nights I'd spent in the basement workshop, crafting toys for his birthday? Or were we just ghosts he'd swept away before the showing, inconvenient reminders of a past he was ready to sell? I sat at that table for hours, watching the light move across the walls, remembering. The day we'd brought Michael home from the hospital, so tiny and perfect in Sarah's arms. His first day of school, standing brave and nervous by the front door. His graduation party, the house full of friends and family, everyone so proud of the man he'd become. When had I stopped mattering to that man? When had my role in his life become so small that he could erase decades of our shared history with a for sale sign and a handshake? Mrs. Henderson probably thought she was sharing happy news. She couldn't have known she was breaking my heart with her casual words. But that's how betrayal often works. It doesn't announce itself with thunder and lightning. It slips in quietly, delivered by well-meaning neighbors who assume you already know your own son has decided to sell your life. If you've ever learned about something important in your child's life from a stranger, you understand the particular shame of that moment. The way you have to pretend you already knew, protect their privacy even as they're breaking your heart. The way you have to smile and nod while your world crumbles, because admitting the truth would hurt them more than it would heal you. And if my story touches something familiar in your own experience, please take a moment to like this video. Oh, and subscribe. Sometimes sharing our pain is the only way to make it bearable. The phone sat silent on the counter, and I stared at it for a long time. Should I call him, confront him, demand to know why he'd kept this from me? But even as I considered it, I knew I wouldn't, because deep down I was afraid of the answer, afraid he'd tell me it was none of my business anymore, afraid he'd confirm what Mrs. Henderson's innocent words had already revealed, that I'd become irrelevant in my own son's life. So I sat in the growing shadows of my kitchen and learned what it meant to be forgotten by the person you'd never stopped loving, never stopped hoping for, never stopped calling your boy. 3 days passed. 3 days of me walking through my house like a man waiting for surgery, checking the phone every hour to see if maybe I'd missed a call. Maybe Michael had tried to reach me, wanted to explain, needed to hear his father's voice before making the biggest decision of his young life. But the phone stayed silent, and my imagination filled the quiet with scenarios that kept me awake at night. Maybe the sale had fallen through. Maybe he'd changed his mind. Maybe Mrs. Henderson had gotten her facts wrong, mixed up our Michael with someone else's son. By Friday evening, I couldn't stand the not knowing anymore. I sat in my chair with the phone in my lap for 20 minutes, rehearsing what I'd say. How do you ask your son why he didn't think you deserved to know he was selling the house you built? How do you bridge 30 years of love with 3 days of silence? My hands shook a little as I dialed his number. It rang 4 times before he picked up. Hey Dad, what's up? His voice sounded distant, distracted. I could hear traffic in the background, the hum of his car radio. He was driving somewhere that mattered more than this conversation we were about to have. Michael, I heard some news about the house. A pause. A long pause that told me everything I needed to know before he said a word. Oh, yeah, I was going to call you about that. When, I wanted to ask, after the closing, after the new owners moved in, after you'd collected every penny and disappeared into your new life without looking back? Mrs. Henderson mentioned it on Tuesday, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Said you'd found a buyer. Right, yeah, it all happened pretty fast. You know how the market is right now. No, I didn't know how the market was right now. I didn't know anything about what was happening in his life anymore. That was becoming painfully clear. Can you talk about it? I mean, if you have time. Another pause. The sound of his turn signal clicking, his attention split between me and wherever he was going. Sure, Dad, but I'm actually heading to dinner with some friends. Rain check? Rain check. Like we were casual acquaintances postponing a coffee date instead of father and son discussing the sale of our family home. Of course. Maybe we could have lunch this weekend, talk it through properly. This weekend's pretty packed, but let me check my schedule and get back to you. We both knew he wouldn't get back to me. We both knew this conversation was as close as we'd get to talking it through properly, and we both pretended otherwise. The thing is, Dad, it was just getting to be too much. The maintenance, the taxes, all of it. I barely have time to keep up with my own apartment, you know. And the money from the sale will really help with my student loans. Too much. The house where he'd grown up, where his mother had raised him, where I'd poured 30 years of my life into every corner, it was too much trouble to keep. I understand, I lied. I knew you would. You're good about stuff like this. Good about stuff like this. When had I become good about having my heart broken? When had I given him the impression tout? Had his father's feelings were so manageable, so predictable, so unimportant? Who bought it? I asked, because I needed to know something, anything about the strangers who would inherit our memories. Young couple, first-time buyers. They seemed really excited about it. Excited, the way Sarah and I had been excited 30 years ago, standing in that empty lot with our dreams and our determination. The way I'd felt watching those first walls go up, knowing I was creating something permanent, something that would shelter my family for generations. That's good. They'll take care of it. Yeah, I think so. Look, Dad, I really need to run. Traffic's getting heavy, and I'm already late. Of course. Drive safe. Will do. Talk soon. The line went dead, and I sat there holding the phone, long after the dial tone started. Talk soon. Another promise that meant nothing, another casual dismissal wrapped in false affection. I'd learned more about the sale of my life's work from Mrs. Henderson than I had from my own son. A 3-minute conversation squeezed between his dinner plans and his schedule, as if 23 years of memories could be summarized in the time it takes to drive across town. He'd made it sound so reasonable, so practical. The maintenance was too much. The taxes were a burden. He needed the money for student loans. All perfectly logical explanations that completely ignored the emotional reality of what that house represented. But maybe that was the problem. Maybe to him it was just a house, 4 walls, and a roof that he'd inherited when his mother died, property that made more sense to liquidate than to keep. Maybe all the love I'd built into those walls, all the memories Sarah and I had created in those rooms, meant nothing to the man my boy had become. Or maybe they did mean something, and that's exactly why he'd kept the sale a secret. Maybe he knew it would hurt me, knew I'd want to talk about it, ask questions, make it more complicated than he wanted it to be. Maybe silence was his way of protecting us, both from a conversation that would only cause pain. But protection built on lies isn't protection at all. It's abandonment dressed up as kindness, erasure disguised as mercy. I thought about calling him back, demanding a real conversation, insisting on my right to be included in decisions that affected our family's legacy. But what was the point? The papers were signed, the deed transferred, the decision final. My opinion had been irrelevant from the beginning. That night I walked through my own house, the smaller place I'd bought after Sarah died, and tried to imagine selling it without telling anyone who mattered. Tried to picture myself making appointments with realtors, hosting open houses, negotiating prices, all while keeping it secret from the people I loved. I couldn't. The very idea felt like betrayal, like denying the relationships that gave my life meaning. But maybe that was the difference between Michael and me. Maybe I still believed that family decisions should involve family, that respect was something you owed the people who'd sacrificed for you. Or maybe I was just an old man, clinging to old ideas about loyalty and inclusion, about the ways fathers and sons should treat each other. Maybe the modern world had moved past the notion that parents deserved a voice in their children's major life decisions. If you've ever realized that your child sees you as optional in their life, understands that your feelings are secondary to their convenience, you know the particular loneliness I felt that night. It's not anger exactly. It's the slow recognition that the relationship you thought was mutual, reciprocal, built on love and respect, was actually just habit, obligation, something to be managed rather than cherished. And if my words resonate with your own experience of being diminished by the people you'd die for, please take a moment to like this video. Leave a comment and subscribe. Your story matters, even when it feels like no one is listening. The call that never came would have been an apology, an explanation, a recognition that I deserved better than learning about my son's major life decisions from the neighbor lady. But Michael didn't think he owed me that call, and maybe he was right. Maybe fathers like me need to learn when our time is over, when our voices no longer matter, when the children we raised have grown into adults who see us as strangers, well-meaning but ultimately irrelevant to their real lives. The silence stretched into days, then weeks, and I began to understand that this was my new normal. Loving someone who had moved on without me, caring about someone who had stopped caring whether I knew or understood or approved of their choices. 2 weeks before the closing, Michael called, not to apologize or explain, but to ask if I wanted anything from the house before the new owners took possession. "There are some family photos still on the walls," he said. "Mom's china is still in the dining room cabinet. I figured you might want some of that stuff." Stuff. 30 years of our lives had been reduced to stuff. "I'd like to walk through one more time," I told him. "Say goodbye properly." He gave me the address like I might have forgotten where I used to live, told me the realtor's lockbox code, said to take whatever I wanted. His voice was businesslike, efficient, like he was delegating a task to someone he barely knew. Saturday morning, I drove the familiar route through town, past the elementary school where Michael had played Little League, past the grocery store where Sarah had shopped every Thursday for 30 years, past the church where we'd been married and where we'd held her funeral. Everything looked the same, but felt different now, like I was visiting a place I used to belong instead of coming home. The house looked smaller somehow, sitting there with a bright red "Sold" banner synced, retched across the realtor's sign. The front porch I'd painted blue-gray was already showing signs of wear. The mailbox Sarah had insisted we replace every few years was tilting slightly to the left, small things that would have driven me crazy when it was still mine to care about. I used the lockbox code Michael had given me and stepped inside. The silence hit me first, not the comfortable quiet of an empty house, but the hollow echo of a place that had been abandoned. The walls looked naked without our furniture, our pictures, our life filling up the spaces. My footsteps sounded too loud on the hardwood floors I'd refinished 3 times over the years. Each room felt like a museum exhibit of my former life, familiar but untouchable. Sacred, but somehow unreal. In the living room, I stood where my chair used to sit and remembered Christmas mornings, birthday parties, quiet evenings when Sarah and I would read while the children played at our feet. The carpet was gone, revealing the beautiful oak floors I'd installed myself when Michael was in high school. I'd forgotten how lovely they were under all those years of family living. The kitchen still smelled faintly like Sarah's cooking, or maybe that was just my imagination filling in what my heart needed to remember. I ran my hand along the countertops I tiled by myself one summer, working late into the evening while she brought me sandwiches and cold beer. She'd sit at the breakfast bar, chatting about her day while I measured and cut and cursed under my breath when the pieces didn't fit quite right. "You don't have to be perfect, David," she'd always say when I'd pull up a tile and start over because it was crooked by a 16th of an inch. But I did have to be perfect. This was our home, our sanctuary, the place where we were building our forever. Every detail mattered because every detail was love made visible. Opened the cabinet where her china had lived for 23 years. Empty shelves stared back at me, but I could still see the delicate blue and white pattern she'd chosen for our first Christmas as homeowners. She'd saved for months to buy that set, one place setting at a time, until we had service for 12. "For when the children are grown and bring their families home," she'd said, carefully arranging each piece in the cabinet. "For when this house is full of grandchildren and holidays and all the beautiful chaos of a big family." The grandchildren had never come. Emma lived too far away, too focused on her career. Michael had never even brought a serious girlfriend home to meet us. The china had sat in that cabinet for decades, waiting for celebrations that never happened, for the big family dinners Sarah had dreamed about but never got to host. Upstairs, I stood in the doorway of Michael's old room. The walls were bare now, but I could still see his baseball posters, his model airplanes hanging from fishing line, his desk where he'd done homework while I helped him with math problems that seemed impossible at the time. "I don't get it, Dad. Why do I need to know about fractions?" "Because someday you might need to measure something, son, like when you're building a house or fixing a car or helping your own kids with their homework." He'd rolled his eyes then, impatient with his old man's practical wisdom, but he'd learned the fractions anyway, learned everything I tried to teach him about measuring twice and cutting once, about taking pride in work well done, about the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands. Had any of those lessons stuck? Or had I been talking to myself all those years, pouring my values into a boy who would grow up to see his childhood home as nothing more than equity to be liquidated? Emma's room was smaller, painted the soft yellow she'd insisted on when she was 12. "Not pink, Daddy. Yellow is happier." I'd spent a weekend taping and painting and listening to her chatter about friends and school and all the dreams that seemed so possible when she was young and we were her whole world. The master bedroom was the hardest. I stood in the doorway for a long time before I could make myself walk inside. This was where Sarah and I had shared 32 years of marriage, where we'd whispered about our hopes for the children, our fears about money, our quiet gratitude for the life we were building together. The window still looked out over her rose garden, though it was overgrown now, wild and untended since she'd gotten too sick to care for it properly. She used to stand at that window every morning with her coffee, planning her day around the needs of her flowers. "They're like children," she'd say when I teased her about spending so much time fussing over them. "They need attention and care and just the right amount of everything to thrive." In the closet, I found a sweater she'd left behind, a soft green cardigan she'd worn every Sunday to church, hanging alone on a wire hanger like it was still waiting for her to come home. I held it to my face and breathed in, searching for any trace of her perfume, her presence, her warmth, but it just smelled like emptiness. The basement workshop was exactly as I'd left it. Michael hadn't even bothered to clear out my tools, my workbench, my half-finished projects. 40 years of accumulated equipment and expertise, dismissed as too much trouble to deal with. I ran my hand over the lathe where I'd turned table legs, the saw where I'd cut boards for Emma's dollhouse, the pegboard where every tool had its proper place. This was where I'd taught Michael to use a hammer, to measure accurately, to respect sharp edges and powerful motors. Where we'd built his Pinewood Derby car, his science fair volcano, the wooden jewelry box he'd made for Sarah's birthday when he was 14. "Hold it steady, son. Let the two will do the work." "Like this, Dad?" "That's it. You're getting the hang of it." Those moments had felt so important then, so full of meaning and connection, father and son working together, creating something beautiful and useful with our hands. I'd thought I was teaching him more than carpentry. I'd thought I was passing down values, building a relationship, creating memories we'd both treasure. But maybe he didn't treasure them. Maybe they were just chores he'd endured to please his old man, obligations he'd fulfilled without really understanding their significance. Maybe the workshop had always been more important to me than to him. I gathered a few things: the framed photo of Sarah from the kitchen windowsill, the wooden jewelry box Michael had made in this very workshop, a handful of Christmas ornaments from the box in the basement. Tokens of a life that had mattered. Evidence that we'd been happy here, that love had lived in these rooms. Walking out for the last time, I turned back to look at the house one more time. It looked patient somehow, ready for new people to fill it with new memories, new laughter, new dreams. The windows reflected the morning sun like eyes that had seen everything and forgiven it all. If you've ever had to say goodbye to a place where your heart still lives, you understand the weight of that moment. The way the past and present collide, the way love and loss become the same thing. And if my story resonates with your own experience of letting go, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe. Sometimes sharing our grief is the only way to honor what we've lost. I got in my car and drove away without looking back again, but for miles I could feel that house behind me, holding all the years we'd shared, all the love we'd invested in its walls, all the dreams that would never be fulfilled within its rooms. The new owners would never know about Christmas morning wrapping paper scattered across the living room, lore. They'd never hear Sarah's laughter echoing from the kitchen or see Michael's first steps across the hardwood. They'd create their own memories, their own traditions, their own version of home. And maybe that was enough. Maybe that was how it was supposed to be. But driving away from 30 years of my life, I felt like I was abandoning not just a house, but everyone I'd ever been within those walls. The young father hanging pictures, the middle-aged man fixing leaky faucets, the widower walking through empty rooms, searching for ghosts that refused to appear. The closing happened on a Tuesday. I wasn't invited, of course. Michael handled everything himself, signed the papers, collected the check, transferred the deed to strangers who would never know that every board in that house had been placed with love. I learned about it the same way I'd learned about the sale, from Mrs. Henderson, who saw the moving truck and mentioned it casually while we both checked our mail. "Looks like it's official now," she said. "Saw your Michael there this morning with the realtor, handing over the keys." I nodded and smiled and pretended this was normal, natural, the way fathers and sons handled important family business. But standing there with a handful of grocery store circulars and overdue bills, I felt something break inside me that I couldn't name. That evening, I sat in my chair and tried to understand how I'd become so irrelevant in my own son's life. When had my voice stopped mattering? When had my feelings become optional, my presence unnecessary? I thought about my own father, a man of few words who worked double shifts at the steel mill to keep food on the table. He wasn't warm or demonstrative, but he was present, solid. When big decisions needed to be made, he made them. When his opinion was required, he gave it. His family might not have always liked what he had to say, but they never questioned whether he had the right to say it. I'd tried to be different with Michael, warmer, more involved, more available for the small moments as well as the big ones. I'd coached his Little League team not because I loved baseball, but because I loved him. I'd helped with homework, attended school plays, cheered at graduation. I'd thought I was building something stronger than what my father and I had shared. But maybe I'd built something weaker instead. Maybe all that warmth and availability had made me seem less important, not more. Maybe respect comes from distance, from being needed rather than simply wanted. Or maybe the problem was simpler than that. Maybe Michael had never needed me the way I'd needed to be needed. Maybe I'd been so busy being the father I'd wanted to have that I'd failed to become the father he actually required. Sarah would have understood this better. Women seem to know instinctively when to hold on and when to let go, when to speak up and when to stay silent. She'd navigated the children's growing independence with a grace I'd never managed to master. "They have to find their own way, David," she'd said during one of my worried phases about Michael's choices. "We gave them roots. Now we have to trust that they'll use them." But what happens when the roots you've given them don't seem strong enough to hold? What happens when your child grows up and away and seems to forget not just where they came from, but who helped them get there? I'd spent 30 years believing that love was enough, that presence was enough, that being a good father meant my son would naturally want to include me in his life, forever. I'd never considered that he might grow up to see me as optional, dispensable, someone whose feelings could be safely ignored. The house sale was just the latest in a series of erasures. Michael had stopped calling regularly 2 years ago, stopped visiting except for obligatory holidays a year before that. stopped asking for advice, sharing his problems, treating me like someone whose opinion mattered even longer ago than that. Each loss had been small enough to rationalize. He's busy with work. He's establishing his independence. This is what healthy young adults do. But together, they added up to a complete withdrawal from the relationship I'd thought was the most important thing in both our lives. Maybe that was my mistake, thinking it was as important to him as it was to me. Maybe fathers love differently than sons, need connection more desperately, hold on longer to relationships that have already run their natural course. I thought about the men of my generation, the fathers I'd known growing up. They'd seemed so certain of their place in the world, so secure in their authority. Their children might rebel or argue, but they never questioned their father's right to be consulted, respected, included. What had changed? When had fathers become optional advisors instead of essential authorities? When had the role that had once carried automatic respect become something you had to constantly earn and re-earn and fight to maintain? Maybe it started when we decided to be friends with our children instead of parents to them. Maybe it began when we started seeking their approval instead of simply expecting their respect. Maybe we'd loved them so much that we'd forgotten to require them to love us back. Or maybe this was always how it worked, and I'd just been naive to think it would be different for us. Maybe every father eventually becomes irrelevant to his children's real lives, kept around for sentiment and obligation, but not truly needed for anything that matters. The thought was unbearable, but I couldn't shake it. All those years of midnight feedings and bedtime stories and patient explanations about why the sky is blue, had they been preparatory for this? For becoming a stranger to the person I'd loved most in the world. I'd given Michael everything I had, my time, my attention, my wisdom, my unconditional support. I'd sacrificed my own interests to focus on his needs, put his dreams ahead of my own comfort, loved him with a fierceness that sometimes frightened me with its intensity. And somehow, all of that had added up to him selling the house I'd built without thinking my feelings mattered enough to mention. Maybe the problem was that I'd made it too easy for him to take me for granted. Maybe children only value what they have to work for, respect only what demands respect. Maybe by being so available, so understanding, so accepting of whatever scraps of attention he threw my way, I'd taught him that his father's feelings were infinitely flexible, endlessly forgiving, ultimately unimportant. But what was the alternative? Becoming cold and distant like my own father? Demanding respect instead of earning it, using guilt and manipulation to force connection that should have come naturally? I couldn't be that kind of father, even if it might have kept me from becoming this kind of father. The kind who learns about his son's major life decisions from neighbors, who gets 3-minute phone calls squeezed between more important appointments, who sits alone in the evening wondering when he became a stranger in his own child's life. If you've ever felt yourself disappearing from your own family, becoming optional in relationships that used to define you, you understand the particular grief I'm describing. It's not the sharp pain of sudden loss, but the slow ache of gradual irrelevance. The quiet realization that the people you'd die for see you as someone they can safely ignore. And if my words touch something familiar in your own experience, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Sometimes the only way to fight erasure is to tell our stories, to insist that our love mattered even when it seems forgotten. That night, I looked through old photo albums, searching for clues about when things had started to change. Pictures of Michael as a baby, reaching for me with chubby hands. As a toddler, riding on my shoulders at the county fair. As a teenager, rolling his eyes but still hugging me goodnight. When had those hugs become perfunctory? When had his smiles become polite instead of genuine? When had I started feeling like I was bothering him instead of blessing him with my presence? The photos couldn't tell me. They only showed the surface of our relationship, the moments when cameras were present and everyone was performing happiness. They couldn't capture the gradual cooling, the slow retreat, the imperceptible shift from love to obligation to indifference. But somewhere in those years of pictures, my son had stopped seeing me as essential and started seeing me as optional. Somewhere in all that love and care and presence, I'd become someone he could sell his childhood home without consulting, someone whose feelings were too unimportant to consider. The erasure of a father happens slowly, then suddenly. One day, you're the center of your child's world, and the next, you're a peripheral figure they occasionally remember to acknowledge. One day, they need you for everything, and the next, they need you for nothing at all. And the worst part is, you never see it coming until it's already too late to stop. The morning after I learned about the closing, I did something I hadn't done in months. I got dressed properly, pressed shirt, clean slacks, the leather shoes Sarah had bought me for our last anniversary. I shaved carefully, combed my hair, looked at myself in the mirror like I was preparing for something important. Maybe I was. Maybe dignity requires preparation, intention, the conscious choice to be more than your circumstances suggest you are. I could have called Michael, could have demanded an explanation, expressed my hurt, made him listen to how his silence had wounded me. Part of me wanted to. Part of me burned with the need to make him understand what his casual dismissal had cost, to force him to acknowledge that his father's feelings mattered. But I'd learned something in the weeks since Mrs. Henderson's innocent revelation. Begging for respect doesn't earn it. Demanding inclusion doesn't create connection. Love that has to be argued for has already been lost. So instead of calling my son, I drove to the cemetery where Sarah rested under a simple granite stone we'd chosen together during her final weeks. The morning was clear and cool, the kind of weather she'd loved for working in her garden. I sat on the small bench beside her grave and talked to her the way I used to talk to her across the breakfast table, sharing the weight of the day before it began. "He sold the house, Sarah. Didn't even tell me about it." The words sounded different spoken aloud, less like a complaint and more like a simple statement of fact. This is what happened. This is what our son chose to do. "I keep thinking about what you'd say if you were here. Probably that I'm holding on too tight, expecting too much. That boys need to make their own mistakes without their fathers hovering over them." A breeze stirred the oak tree overhead, scattering a few early leaves across her stone. I brushed them away gently, the way she used to brush crumbs from the kitchen counter after every meal. "But this feels different, doesn't it? This feels like he's not just pulling away, he's pushing me out entirely. Like 30 years of being his father counts for nothing when it comes to the decisions that matter." I'd brought flowers, roses from the bush in my backyard that had grown from a cutting she'd taken from her garden years ago. Somehow, our roses had survived the transplanting better than I had. "I don't know how to love someone who doesn't want to be loved by me anymore," I told her. "I don't know how to be a father to a son who's decided I'm not necessary." But sitting there in the quiet morning light, surrounded by the names and dates of other people's beloved dead, I began to understand something I'd been too hurt to see before. My love for Michael didn't depend on his love for me. My identity as his father wasn't diminished by his choice to exclude me from his life. I was still the man who had held him when he was sick, taught him to ride a bicycle, stayed up nights helping him with college applications. I was still the father who had worked extra shifts to pay for his education, who had cheered at every game even when he spent most of it on the bench, who had been proud of him every single day of his life. Those years hadn't been erased by his recent silence. That love hadn't been invalidated by his current indifference. The father I'd been, the father I still was, existed independently of his recognition or acknowledgement. Sarah had always said that love was a choice you made, regardless of what you got back. "You don't love someone because they deserve it," she'd tell me when I complained about ungrateful relatives or difficult friends. "You love them because you choose to, because love is about who you are, not who they are." Maybe that was the lesson I'd been too proud to learn. Maybe dignity came not from being needed or respected or included, but from continuing to love without requiring anything in return. I started writing letters to Sarah that week. Not emails or texts, but actual letters written by hand on the good stationery she'd kept in the desk drawer for special occasions. I told her about my days, my thoughts, my struggles to understand this new version of fatherhood that seemed to require so much letting go. Writing to her helped clarify my own thinking, forced me to articulate feelings I'd been carrying around like stones in my chest. The act of putting pen to paper, of choosing words carefully, of organizing my thoughts into coherent sentences, it felt like prayer, like meditation, like the kind of useful work my hands had been missing. I also started calling old friends, men I'd worked with, neighbors I'd shared decades of small talk and borrowed tools, relationships I'd let drift after Sarah died, when I'd been too wrapped up in my own grief to maintain the social connections that make life bearable. "David, I was just thinking about you," said Tom Mitchell, who'd retired from the county road department the same year I had. "How are you holding up?" How was I holding up? The honest answer was complicated, but I found myself saying, I'm learning to stand up straighter. And somehow that was true. Each conversation, each letter, each morning when I chose to get dressed properly and face the day with intention, they were all small acts of self-respect. Tiny declarations that I still mattered even when the person who'd mattered most to me had decided otherwise. I started a garden in my backyard, something I'd always left to Sarah, but found myself drawn to now. Nothing elaborate, tomatoes, peppers, a few herbs, some flowers that would attract butterflies. But the act of planting, tending, nurturing something from seed to harvest gave my days structure and purpose. Working in the soil reminded me of building the house all those years ago. The same attention to detail, the same faith in slow progress, the same satisfaction in creating something beautiful and useful with my own hands. My back ached more than it used to, and my knees protested when I knelt too long, but the work felt good, necessary, like proof that I still had something to contribute to the world. Michael never called to ask how I was adjusting to the news of the sale, never checked to see if I needed anything from the house, never offered to explain his decision or apologize for keeping me in the dark. The silence stretched into weeks, then months, and I gradually stopped expecting it to break. But I also stopped letting his silence define my worth. I was more than his opinion of me, bigger than his need to exclude me, stronger than his casual dismissal. The love I'd poured into raising him hadn't disappeared just because he no longer seemed to value it. Some evenings I'd sit on my back porch watching the sun set behind the trees and feel something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Not happiness exactly, but a kind of quiet satisfaction in my own company, my own choices, my own version of a life well lived. If you've ever had to find your dignity in the absence of recognition, in the silence where appreciation used to live, you understand the work I'm describing. It's not easy to love yourself when the people you've loved most seem to have forgotten your value, but it's necessary work, maybe the most important work any of us will ever do. And if my words resonate with your own journey toward self-respect, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, and subscribe. Sometimes the greatest gift we can give each other is permission to matter, even when we feel forgotten. I couldn't control Michael's choices, couldn't force him to include me in his life, couldn't make him see me as essential when he'd decided I was optional. But I could control my own response. I could choose dignity over desperation, self-respect over self-pity, quiet strength over loud demands for attention. The house was sold. The relationship I'd thought would last forever had been reduced to occasional duty calls and polite holiday visits. The son I'd raised with such hope and love had become a stranger who managed me like an obligation. But I was still here, still standing, still capable of love and growth and meaning, even in the space where his appreciation used to live. And maybe, in the end, that was enough. 6 months have passed since Michael sold the house. 6 months of learning to live with the kind of wound that doesn't heal cleanly, doesn't disappear with time, but settles into something you carry without letting it carry you. I drove past the old neighborhood last week. Not intentionally. I was coming back from the hardware store and took a wrong turn, or maybe my heart took the turn my mind wasn't ready for. There it was, the house I'd built with my own hands, looking different but not wrong. The new owners had painted the front door red instead of the forest green Sarah had chosen. They'd planted marigolds where her roses used to bloom, added a playground set in the backyard where our vegetable garden had thrived. A child's bicycle lay on its side in the driveway, bright yellow with training wheels, exactly like the one I'd bought Michael for his 6th birthday. It should have broken my heart all over again, seeing strangers living their life in the space where we'd lived ours. But instead, I felt something unexpected. Gratitude. The house was being loved again, filled with the laughter of children, home to new dreams and new beginnings. That little yellow bicycle told me everything I needed to know. This wasn't a house being treated as an investment or left empty to appreciate and value. This was a family creating memories, building traditions, learning what it means to belong somewhere completely. Maybe that's what Michael knew when he sold it, something I'd been too hurt to understand at the time. Maybe he recognized that the house deserved to be lived in, not preserved as a monument to the past. Maybe his decision wasn't rejection, maybe it was release. I still haven't heard from him directly about the sale. Our conversations, when they happen, skate around the edges of anything meaningful. He asks about my health, I ask about his work. We both pretend this distance is normal and comfortable, instead of the careful choreography of two people avoiding the truth. But I've stopped waiting for the apology I once thought I deserved, stopped hoping for the conversation that might explain his silence. Some wounds teach you that healing doesn't require the other person's participation. Some kinds of growth happen in the space where understanding used to live. My garden is thriving. The tomatoes came in heavy this summer, more than I could eat or give away. I learned to can them the way Sarah used to, following the recipe she'd written in careful cursive on an index card yellowed with age. Standing in my kitchen, surrounded by the smell of boiling water and fresh herbs, I felt her presence so strongly it took my breath away. Not sadness this time, but connection. As if love really doesn't die when people do, it just changes form, becomes something you carry forward instead of something you share. The letters I write to Sarah have become a daily practice now, a way of processing not just grief but gratitude for everything we had together. 32 years of marriage, 2 children raised to adulthood, a house built with our own dreams and determination. When I count what we accomplished together instead of what we lost, the math comes out different. Michael may have sold the physical building, but he can't sell the memories we created there. He can't erase the love that went into every room, the care that shaped every corner, the family bond that made those walls sacred. That belongs to me forever, regardless of who holds the deed. I've started volunteering at the community center, teaching basic woodworking to teenagers who remind me of Michael at that age. Eager but impatient, talented but unfocused, hungry for skills their fathers never had time to teach them. Working with my hands again, passing on knowledge that might otherwise be lost, feels like the most useful thing I've done in years. "Mr. Johnson, this joint doesn't look right," one of the boys said last week, holding up a piece he'd been struggling with for an hour. "Let me show you something," I told him, taking the wood and adjusting his angle. "See how the grain runs? You want to work with it, not against it. Like this." Watching his face light up when he got it right reminded me why teaching matters, why patience matters, why the slow work of passing knowledge from one generation to the next is never wasted, even when it feels unappreciated. Maybe that's what I was really trying to do all those years with Michael, not just build him a house, but teach him how to build his own life. Maybe the lessons took, even if he never learned to value the teacher. The men in my woodworking class don't know about my son or the house or the silence that stretches between us. They just know I'm someone who shows up every Tuesday evening, someone who knows how to use tools and isn't afraid to share that knowledge. In their eyes, I'm not a discarded father. I'm a craftsman, a teacher, a man with something valuable to offer. That recognition doesn't replace Michael's love, but it reminds me that my worth isn't determined by one relationship, no matter how important that relationship used to be. I am more than someone's father, bigger than someone's disappointment, stronger than someone's indifference. If you've ever had to rebuild your identity after the people you loved most decided you weren't necessary to their happiness, you understand the work I'm describing. It's not about replacing love. It's about discovering that your capacity for love is larger than any single relationship, even the ones that define you. Tom Mitchell and I have coffee every Thursday morning now. 2 old men solving the world's problems over eggs and bacon at the diner downtown. We talk about everything and nothing, politics, weather, grandchildren he sees regularly, and the grandson I may never meet. He doesn't ask about Michael, and I don't volunteer information. Some silences are comfortable, protective, necessary. "You seem different lately," he said last week, studying my face over his coffee cup. "Steadier, somehow." "I'm learning to stand on my own," I told him. "Good for you," he said simply. "That's not easy at our age." No, it's not easy, but it's possible. And maybe that's the gift hidden in this particular kind of heartbreak. The discovery that you're stronger than you knew, more resilient than you believed, capable of finding meaning and purpose even when the relationship that gave your life its primary meaning disappears. The house is gone. The daily phone calls stopped years ago. The son I raised with such hope and devotion has become someone who manages our relationship like a minor obligation. But I'm still here. Still capable of love, still able to contribute, still worthy of respect and inclusion even when they're not offered. My story doesn't have a Hollywood ending. Michael and I haven't reconciled, haven't had the tearful conversation where he apologizes and I forgive and we rebuild what was broken between us. Maybe we never will. Maybe some relationships don't survive the transition from childhood to adulthood, from dependence to independence, from father and son to two men who happen to share DNA and history. But that doesn't mean the love was wasted or the years were meaningless. It just means love sometimes has to be its own reward, and being a good father has to be satisfaction enough, regardless of whether the child grows up to appreciate what you sacrificed for them. I keep his baby pictures on my mantle, not out of sentimentality, but out of stubborn joy. That little boy reaching for me with chubby hands, that toddler who thought I could fix anything, that teenager who still hugged me goodnight despite his friends thinking it was uncool. He was real. Our love was real. The father I was to him was real, even if the man he became doesn't seem to remember. And if my story reached something familiar in your own heart, if you've ever felt the particular pain of being forgotten by someone you could never forget, I want you to know this: you are not alone. Your love mattered. Your sacrifices had meaning. Your worth isn't determined by whether someone else recognizes it. Please take a moment to like this video, share your own story in the comments, and subscribe for more. Sometimes the most important thing we can do is remind each other that we matter, even when it feels like no one is paying attention. The house that held my life is gone, but the life itself continues. Different than I'd planned, quieter than I'd hoped, but still full of possibility and purpose, and the kind of love that doesn't require permission or recognition to exist. Maybe that's what remains after the house, the understanding that home was never the building anyway. It was always the love, the memories, the choice to keep caring even when caring isn't returned. And that can't be sold, can't be taken away, can't be erased by silence or indifference or the casual cruelty of being forgotten. That remains, that endures, that is mine to keep, regardless of what anyone else chooses to remember or forget.